Donald Trump's popularity continues to surge, with him now leading President Biden by 2% nationwide. Compare this to Biden's 7% lead in 2020, and we see that Trump is performing 9 points better this year than in the previous election. This raises a question: how much can Trump win the election by if things continue to go his way? In this video, we'll break down Donald Trump's best case scenario in the 2024 presidential election and see how many electoral votes he can win. Let's head over to the map. We're going to start off by filling in the solid states for President Trump. These are going to be the states that he is going to very easily win by margins of 12 percentage points or more. They're going to include the traditionally safe Republican states in the center of the country. He's going to win all of Nebraska with the exception of the 2nd District, as well as most of the Deep South, including South Carolina, and in the Midwest, Indiana will also go to President Trump by a solid margin. We will also include Alaska with its 3 electoral votes. The state has been a bit shaky for Republicans in recent years, especially with a Democrat, Mary Peltola, being elected to the House from the state in 2022, but as a whole, Alaska is still one of the most conservative states in the country. So this gives Trump 125 electoral votes, but in a scenario like this, he is going to win a few more states by a solid 12-point margin, and those 2 states are going to be Iowa and Ohio, 2 states that Trump won in both 2016 and 2020. They were both part of the Obama coalition in both 2008 and 2012, going to Obama by likely margins in those 2 elections. But in 2016, Trump flipped these 2 Midwestern states and made them very Republican, and those states have not gone back to the Democrats ever since. Trump won both of them by around 8 to 9 points in both 2016 and 2020. Joe Biden did not perform any better in Iowa and Ohio than Clinton did in 2016. And so in a best case scenario for Donald Trump, he can certainly win both Iowa and Ohio by a solid 12-point margin, giving him 148 electoral votes. Before we move on to categorizing the solid states for President Biden, please take this time to consider subscribing. Only 15% of you guys are, and it would be great to continue growing this channel before the election. So for Joe Biden, most of his solid states from 2020 are going to be solid for him once again, even in a scenario like this, but there are a few exceptions, namely the states of New Jersey and Oregon. Illinois went to Biden by 17 points last time, and I think he's going to be able to win it by just over 12%, so it's barely going to be a solid state for the incumbent president, but it's not really going to make too much of a difference in terms of the electoral count, how these states vote, but in total they will give Joe Biden 159 electoral votes to Trump's 148. Now Biden might be ahead right now, but there are going to be a lot of likely and lean states that would go to the former president in a scenario where Trump continues to increase in popularity as he has been over the last few months. The first likely state I'm going to place into the Trump column will be Texas, the 2nd largest state by population. Its 40 electoral votes will be critical in helping him get over 270. Trump has not won Texas by a double-digit margin in his 2 elections, and so that's why I'm not placing it as a solid state. He won it by 9 in 2016 and only 5 points in 2020. Generally speaking, Texas is shifting to the left. However, in a best-case scenario for Trump, of course, he would be able to easily hold on to it. I believe that Trump can win the Lone Star State by a double-digit margin in 2024, but it's probably not going to be over 12 points, and that's why Texas is only going to be placed into the likely column, states that will go for either candidate by margins of between 5 and 12%. As for Florida, the state will also be in the likely Trump column, although it's gone through a pretty different change over the last few years from Texas, almost the complete opposite. Texas went from being one of the most competitive states in the country in the early 2000s, and now it's pretty firmly in the Republican camp. Donald Trump won Florida in 2016 by a 1-point margin, expanded that to 3 points in 2020, and then most recently in 2022, Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio won their re-elections as governor and senator by a solid 16 and 20 point margin in the state. So Florida is not the competitive state it once was. It used to be a bellwether. It predicted correctly the elections of Bush as well as Obama and even Bill Clinton, but that simply is no longer the case. Trump won Florida in 2020 despite Joe Biden winning the election, and so Florida will be in the likely Republican column. I think the margin can be close to around 10% in a best case scenario for the former president, but it's going to be at least 5 nonetheless. We also have the 2nd District of Maine. This is going to be in the likely Trump column, giving him an additional electoral vote. The district has been pretty favorable to Trump in recent years, but it has kind of hit its cap in terms of how Republican it really can be. Trump did very well there in both 2016 and 2020. I think he'll do better in 2024 in a scenario like this, but breaking 12% is going to be relatively difficult. We also have the states of North Carolina and Georgia. Georgia was a state that Biden actually flipped in 2020, the first Democrat to win it since 1992, while in North Carolina the race was very competitive, went down to a 1.3% margin, but ultimately President Trump was able to hold on to it. In a best case scenario, obviously for Trump, he's going to win both of these states back, and he's going to win them pretty big by a likely margin. I would estimate around 6% in North Carolina, around 5% in Georgia. North Carolina has proven to be slightly more conservative than Georgia in recent years. Democrats were able to win back both Senate seats in the Peach State in 2020, and so both of these states are going to be in the likely Republican column after being some of the most competitive ones in the 2020 election. Georgia has not been polling great for Joe Biden. If you look at the most recent poll out of the state, Joe Biden really has a lot of work to do in these two states, especially Georgia if he wants to hold on to it, as right now Trump is up by 6.6% in the state of Georgia, and he leads by 9 points in the state of North Carolina. So these two states are going to be easy victories for the former president considering the national environment. Now, obviously, there are going to be likely states for Biden as well, most glaringly Oregon and New Jersey. These states were solid for the president in 2020, but in 2024, in a best-case scenario for Trump, they're probably going to be likely states, probably still double-digit margins, but just not quite 12 points. And the final likely state for Biden is going to be Colorado. He won the state by 14 points in the last election. He can win it by at least 5 in 2024, and so an additional 10 electoral votes will put Biden up at 191 electoral votes, with all of his solid and likely states filled in, to 251 for former President Trump. As for lean states, I'm going to start with Biden. He's going to win both Virginia and New Mexico. These states are going to be a lot closer than they were in 2020, but I do think he'll still be able to hold on to them. Virginia is not as strong for Democrats as people once thought. They recently lost the governorship in 2021, and even in 2016, when Hillary Clinton ran with longtime Virginia Senator Tim Kaine as her running mate, she did not win Virginia by more than 5%, and so that's why I'm going to categorize Virginia as being lean Democrat, while New Mexico and its 5 electoral votes are going to be lean as well. It's going to be slightly less solid for Biden than Colorado, as has been the general theme over the last few years, and so this will put Biden over 200 electoral votes finally. We're now going to get Nebraska and Maine out of the way. Nebraska, the 2nd district, I have going to Trump with a tilt margin, that being a margin of less than 1%, and lean, of course, states like Virginia and New Mexico, these are going to be margins of between 1 and 5%. So in the 2nd district of Nebraska, Trump won it in 2016 and lost it in 2020. I think he can win it back in 2024 in a best case scenario, while in Maine, the state is still going to go to the incumbent president, but by a pretty weak lean margin, probably the closest race in Maine we're going to see over the last 2 decades, and so this will give Biden an additional 2 electoral votes. And so we now have just 75 electoral votes left, split across 7 states. These are some of the most competitive states in the country. We have the 3 upper Rust Belt states, as well as Nevada and Arizona in the Sun Belt, and then Minnesota and New Hampshire. So I'm going to start off with the states of Arizona and Nevada. These 2 states are likely to go to Donald Trump in a best case scenario, Joe Biden won Arizona by a measly 0.3% margin in 2020, so it's pretty reasonable to expect Trump to win it back in his best case scenario. And in Nevada, Democrats haven't really been doing the greatest here in the last few years. Barack Obama did very well in the Silver State in his 2 elections. He even won Nevada by a double-digit margin in 2008, but both Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton only won Nevada by 2.8% in the last 2 elections, and so Trump can easily flip the spade, especially considering the fact that Joe Lombardo, a Republican, recently unseated incumbent Democratic Governor Steve Sisolak in 2022. And when looking at the polling, it becomes even clearer why I've put these 2 states in the Trump column. In Nevada, the former president leads by 5.4% on average, while in Arizona, Trump is ahead by 4.8%. So these states are going to be competitive nonetheless, and if Trump's popularity decreases, I can expect it getting competitive once again. But as of right now, Nevada and Arizona are pretty firmly in the Trump camp, especially in his best case scenario, and this puts him at just 1 electoral vote away from 270. Trump now has a flip under his belt, that of course being in Nevada, in terms of states that he did not win in either 2016 or 2020. In 2016, Trump flipped Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Iowa, Ohio, and Florida, but he did not win in Nevada. And in 2020, of course, Trump lost many of those states in the upper Rust Belt, as well as Georgia and Arizona. But in a scenario like this in 2024, he can certainly keep all of the states he won in 2016 and 2020 and even expand his electoral lead with a state like Nevada. This would boost Republicans for elections to come and seriously harm Democrats over the next few decades if Trump can capture the Silver State. And so now moving on to the upper Rust Belt, this should not be a new sight to anyone. These 3 states were pivotal in the last 2 elections. Wisconsin got Trump over 270 in 2016, and Pennsylvania did the same for Joe Biden in 2020. And so in these states, the polling right now is looking pretty bleak for Democrats. Joe Biden is not performing well in them at all. In Wisconsin, this is the best state that Biden's performing in. The polling currently shows a tie between the 2 candidates, but in a best case scenario for Trump, I will give it to him with a lean margin of victory. As for Michigan, Trump is doing even better, leading by 5.3 percentage points. Michigan is supposedly supposed to be the most liberal out of the 3 upper Rust Belt states. I do think that trend is going to continue. This prediction is not based on the polls. This is simply the best case scenario for Trump if things continue to go his way based on electoral trends over the last few years. Just really the maximum amount Trump can realistically win. This is not what the polling is telling us now, and obviously the polling is going to tell us very different things by the time we're in November. And so finally, in the Keystone state of Pennsylvania, this is Joe Biden's birth state. Trump leads by 0.3%. The races in both Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, and of course Michigan, are going to be very competitive. But as of right now, considering Trump's rise in popularity, in a best case scenario for him, we can expect all 3 of them to be in his column, winning him 313 electoral votes. We are now left with Minnesota and New Hampshire, 2 states Joe Biden won by 7% in 2020. Minnesota actually has the longest Democratic voting streak. It's voted Democrat in every single election for nearly half a century. It was the only state that Ronald Reagan did not win in 1984, so that's why Minnesota holds a title for being the state with the longest continuous streak of voting for the Democratic nominee in presidential elections. And so I do believe that streak will continue even if the circumstances are as optimal as possible for former President Trump, but it is going to be very, very close, decided by just a tilt margin. And finally, we are left with New Hampshire. It has 4 electoral votes. It's not likely to be a game changer. However, the state can be very conservative at times. In 2020-2022, it reelected its Republican governor Chris Sununu by solid 30-40 percentage point margins. The state can really vote Republican depending on who the candidate is, and with Joe Biden as unpopular as he is right now, I think that it is possible for Donald Trump to win New Hampshire in a best case scenario. I don't think it's at all guaranteed. And if Joe Biden is able to improve in the polling, I think there's nearly no chance that Trump realistically wins New Hampshire. But as of right now, considering the circumstances, the national environment changing in favor of Donald Trump, I think New Hampshire is at least within play for the former president if things continue to go his way. And so this will give Donald Trump 317 electoral votes to Joe Biden with 221. Now, that's not a massive change from the last few elections, although it is a pretty big boost for Trump considering he only won 232 electoral votes in 2016, so it's not really the biggest boost possible. He's probably not going to win over 320 even in a best case scenario because of just how polarized our country is. It's important to actually note the margins in these states. I mean, Iowa and Ohio are solid, pretty strong showings for Trump in North Carolina and Georgia, as well as many of these solid Democratic states being much closer for Joe Biden. So that's where you see the biggest changes. But in this best case scenario for Trump, even without many of the lean states, Trump would almost be at nearly 270 electoral votes. So he's going to easily win the election if things continue to go his way, but of course we're still nearly a year out and a lot of things can change.